Today, I want to talk about the Ethiopian Bible. The Ethiopian Bible. And I want to talk about it in a historical context so that we can understand the historic significance of the Ethiopian Bible and to be able to get a better understanding of its important historical context. As part of that discussion, I'm also going to talk about the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church and its historic role in Ethiopia. And one of the things that I think is happening right now, there's a big push. You hear a lot of places people are discussing the Ethiopian Bible, and they say that, well, the Ethiopian Bible has 88 books rather than the 66 books by the King James Version that are contained in the King James Version. And so they speculate that the Ethiopian Bible contains a bunch of hidden and new information that we've never seen before, that's not been available. And that's kind of generally what's thought out there in the community when you have the basic discussions with people, and when you listen, you recognize that this distinction between 66 books in the so-called Protestant version and the 88 books in the Ethiopian Bible, that many people are rushing out to try to get the book because they want to see all of these extra things that are in there that's missing, that reveal this full truth. But in reality, the vast majority of the books that are in the Ethiopian Bible that are not in the King James Version and most Protestant versions are part of what's called the Apocrypha. And the Apocrypha is a set of well-known Christian writings that were not included as canonical books. They were not included as official manuscripts of the Bible. And part of the reason was because of either they were books that did not meet certain criteria in terms of to establish their authenticity, or they were produced after 200 AD or CE. And so you have books that are called Apocrypha that are not considered canonical, and then you have books published after 200 CE that are called the Epigrapha. And they are books that may talk about subjects related to the religion, but in fact, they have no original connection to any of the apostles or to people that were in a direct line with the apostles. And so because of this, they are considered just outside of that particular period of time. Now, these books have always been considered to have value by many people, especially in the scholarly community, and also many people in the religious community. It's just that they classify the books differently. So for the Ethiopian Bible actually includes some books that are considered apocrypha in other denominations, and there are also some books that are in addition to apocrypha, epigrapha, or pseudepigrapha books that they were written after 200. And so, in terms of, it's important to be able to recognize these classifications, and also note that there's no evidence that Ethiopians did not clearly understand the distinctions between these books. They just split off somewhere around 451 and established a separate denomination. So they established their own church system under the Ethiopian Orthodox Chiwahito church system. And then as a result of this split, they began to follow different traditions. And they split off over a debate that occurred during something that was called the Council of Chalcedony in 451. And the issue was the nature of the deity, the nature of Christ. And that was where the split came. And they became what is called a Miaphysite church. And there are also several other Miaphysite churches that developed. And I'll mention some of them in just a minute. But I think it's important to recognize that there's a group that formed what's called the, excuse me, the Oriental Church. And then you also had the Roman Church, and you had the Eastern Orthodox Church. And it's important to understand the distinctions between these various different church groups. The Roman Church actually ultimately ruled over the Roman Empire and became, the significant leading church body and organization within the Roman Empire. And the Eastern Orthodox Church ruled in the areas that would be Russia in the Far East Asia, and this became, they had separate systems, and then of course the Oriental Church included the Coptics. It included the Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahida Church. And it, included the Syrian Orthodox Tawahida Church and several others. But in terms of looking at and understanding these divisions, I wanted to kind of paint that background before I actually go into the significance of the Ethiopian Bible. Well, let me go back to try to put it together, and that is that if we go back into ancient Egypt during its first periods of development, the first period was called hieroglyphic writing. And hieroglyphs used what's called the ideogram and phonogram. It had a certain structure. It used a cartouche. It used a bunch of different symbols to represent ideals. And it was a language that presented images for ideals, and then an image to represent a phonetic representation, so ideograms and phonograms. And so hieroglyph became actually considered a sacred language. And then the common everyday communications and all that eventually began to use what's called hieratic writing. And hieratic writing was more of an alphabetical based type of writing system. And then that system evolved to what's called demotic, and then ultimately to Meroic. And so these were the major systems in ancient Egypt that evolved. And when we look at the writing system, this wasn't the only branch of writings and language that came out of ancient Egypt. If we go back and look at Martin Delany, who was the highest ranking Black American military officer in the American Civil War, he was a major. Martin Delany also was a physician. He was a medical doctor, and he was a very distinguished scholar. And he started writing prior to the Civil War. And but in 1879, he published a very significant book called The Origin of Colors. And his Origins of Colors actually was a book talking about history. And in it, what he does is he outlines a linguistic tree to show the advances of languages and where they came from and how they track back to ancient Egypt. So he showed this line where you have the hieratic, the hieroglyph, you have the hieratic, the demotic, the Meroic. And then he also showed that out of Egypt also came what would be called um, Proto-Phoenician, Proto-Canaan, and Proto-Semitic and Semitic. So you had these different systems that developed and that ultimately came down into South Arabia and created a South Arabian branch of language that was very distinguishable from Arabic. So you had a South Arabian language, and then you also had languages that were Ethiopian. And of prominence was a language called Ge'ez. There was also Amhara grew out of that. But Ge'ez was a very important language in from about 1200 BC to about 500 BC. There was a kingdom called the Kingdom of Demet. Demet is actually pronounced multiple different ways. There's no consonant in the, or no vowels in the language, in the writing, and in particular, the name of this place is actually capital D apostrophe MT is very often how it's represented, but it is a early kingdom in the territory of Ethiopia. It also was part of like where modern day Eritrea and Djibouti are also located. So all of this was part of this kingdom, Demet, in the kingdom of Demet. And their official language from about 1200 BC until about 500 BC was the language called Ge'ez. And so there is a substantial amount of information about this particular place, and the fact that its language survived and its culture, and they practice many different forms of worship there. But of significance, it was an indigenous language that was there that is called Ge'ez. And so after 500 BC, the several other kingdoms began to emerge. And one of those kingdoms was called Axum. And as Axum emerged, now you'll hear people talk about Put or Punt or Put, and sometimes it's pronounced Punt and spelled P-U-N-T. Sometimes it's pronounced Put. So there's a bunch of different names that are used, but if we look at this particular region, there was a dominant kingdom there called the kingdom of Demet, and then it was followed by a dominant kingdom also called Axum. And so Axum began to develop there, and it eventually gained prominence. And then the kingdom of Axum, during the particular period of time when the Christianity developed, there is multiple different stories and multiple different representations, and there was a man known as Fumentus, and Fumentus was considered Saint Fumentus at one point, and he was also supposed to had come from Syria, and he was part of the Roman Church during that particular time, and he was actually part of the general church, and this was before the churches split into major factions that would be distinguishable as Roman and Eastern Orthodox, etc. But Fumentus, on behalf of the early church, actually is alleged to have converted King Azania of Axum, and that as a result of that, the Ethiopian church was born, and that the Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahida Church was born at that time. And so it became the state religion in 325 AD. So it was the first nation to adopt Christianity. And it adopted Christianity before Rome adopted it as their religion. Rome adopted Christianity in 379 under Emperor Theodosius. And the Ethiopians adopted it in 325 under King Azania. And under King Azania, the first bishop of Ethiopia was appointed, was this gentleman by the name of Fumentus. But when we actually analyze the situation, what we can see, and we can go back and there's plenty of evidence to establish that the Christian church already was flourishing and thriving in Ethiopia long before its emperor actually adopted Christianity. And so, like many other places, the rulers, the people that were in power, saw Christianity as a threat and persecuted Christians, as in, for example, in Rome, where they persecuted Christians first, and then they eventually, it was so many that they ultimately adopted the religion. And then it became the structural foundation of their government, and they, in terms of, then they began to mold and shape it in a formal way. So the formal religion actually began to take shape in that manner. But there were always these communities of people that were close to the apostles, the original apostles, that worshiped outside of the system and that often saw the system in a separate light than they saw their communities, from which in many cases they had been persecuted by the governmental entities. And so there were such communities all over Ethiopia. There was also communities that had followed the Torah at earlier periods. So there was a large, what would be called Jewish population in Ethiopia at that time. And so it's important to recognize that when the Ethiopian Tawahida Church was actually formed, what they did was, over a period of time, they collected the religious texts that were already in usage, that were published in Greek and Latin, and they used those writings in order to translate into Ge'ez, which was considered a sacred language among the people of Axum. And so it became what's called a liturgical language. It was the language of the religion. It was like a sacred language that was used. And so they translated the Bible over a period of time. Not only did they translate the 66 books and the 71 books from the Catholics, but they also translated many of the Apocrypha and Epigrapha. And they came up with their own separate independent canon that was consistent with their doctrinal beliefs that they adopted, and particularly after the Council of Chalcedony in 451. And so what you ended up with was a independent church in Ethiopia, an independent church system. And this independent church system took the Bible scriptures, the Old Testament, the New Testament, and they translated those writings as well as many other writings into Ge'ez, into a sacred and separate language. So this represented the preservation of the early Christian traditions and Christian history in such a way that really was unprecedented, because you had multiple different people translating and doing, all kinds of things, but the preservation of this doctrine and this tradition and history in Ge'ez became very important, because it takes us closer to the what would be considered authentic in terms of because it's translated at an early period and then it's preserved and codified into the what would be now called the Ethiopian Bible. But you have to remember that the Ethiopian Bible, as well as any other Bible, the phenomena of having a complete Bible is a relatively new thing, because most Bibles were actually multiple books. There were multiple religious writings, and there was a sacred body of writings that were usually considered authentic or part of the canon. And so it's important to be able to make that distinction, but the fact that they're all preserved in Ge'ez is something that's very significant. And so we can go back and we can look at all of the various different councils that took place. There were like 7 ecumenical councils that took place up to like close to like 1000 AD. And they all made different kinds of modifications and things to the Bible. Like, for example, I think it's First John 5:7. It talks about, it says, for there are 3 that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit. Well, that's not in the Ethiopian Bible, in the Ge'ez version, because it is a later addition that was added by an ecumenical council. There's also, for example, the chapter 16, verses 9 through 20 in the book of Mark is something that was added later. So, in addition to that, there are many other differences that that are there. And say, for example, in the Catholic version, there's the story of the Maccabees, books 1, 2, 3, and in the Ethiopian Bible, there is a version of Maccabees. It's spelled very differently, and it actually has a different subject matter. The story is very different. So you have that difference. But for the most part, the book of Enoch, the books, of Tobit and Judith, and many other of the books are, in fact, part of the Apocrypha. And they were known, but they just were excluded because they were not considered to be canonical. And so this is important to be able to recognize that these early traditions that much of the church accepted very early was later changed and modified by different ecumenical councils. Now, what the reasons are can be debated. There were some books that, that basically promoted revolutionary ideals, that promoted ideals that the governments didn't want to be widespread ideals. And because there was no separation between church and state, they suppressed some of those books. They removed some of those books. So all of those things are very important in terms of, if we went into an in-depth and detailed study of this. But what becomes most significant in the context of Black history is that the Ethiopian Tawhida Church was officially established in 325. And there were Ethiopian churches that existed prior to that were ultimately consolidated. And of course, there are other denominations in Ethiopia now, but about 44% of the population of Ethiopia today are part of the Ethiopian Tawhida Church. And so when we look at it, it is the longest standing church, the Christian church that exists in the world today. It has been in existence consistently, and it has had its own system in terms of its own theology, its own belief systems that are rooted in the Bible, but they are what's called Miaphysite versus Dinophysite, such as most of the other churches are today. And so because of their belief regarding the nature of Christ. And so I don't want to go into the theology of it. I want to stick to the historical component of it. But this was a church that remained intact. It actually, between the 6th and 10th centuries, it built about 11 rock-hewn churches. And it built these rock-hewn churches that were very difficult to destroy. And this was a period of time when there were attacks by Islamic forces to attempt to overthrow, and there were constant attempts to overthrow them. But they were able to resist these attacks and remain independent. And part of this was because they had established a tradition that was really built in stone. So they built these rock-hewn churches. They had their version of scripture that was in their sacred language, which was the when this was the foundation, the bedrock for the Ethiopian society. And so they resisted and were able to remain independent in spite of the attacks. Now, it's important to look at just a couple of things I want to point out that are really important. And that is that around 520, between 520 and 523 CE or AD, the Ethiopian church had spread across the Red Sea into southern Yemen. And southern Yemen, and what you'll see is if you look at and study the DNA evidence, if you look at the DNA evidence, the DNA evidence will show some admixture between Ethiopians and the people of southern Arabia. But the dominant is African DNA. So these were African people who had some admixture with southern Arabia. But it's important, and particularly the area that's called Yemen. And so at about 523 CE, there was a group of people who practiced Christianity in Yemen, in the region of southern Arabia, the southern region of Arabia, that were attacked, and there was something called the Najran, Najran, the Najran massacre. And so there's a city there where it was a Christian kingdom that existed there. And then there was a kingdom called the Himyarite, Himyrite, the Himyarite kingdom. And the Himyarite kingdom was a Jewish kingdom in southern Arabia, near the border in a important historical city called Sana'a. And so in this region, this border region, this kingdom of the Himyarite kingdom decided to attack the Christians, and they massacred, it's estimated, between 70 and 100,000 Christians, and attempting to force them to accept Judaism. And this occurred just before the birth of Muhammad ibn Abdullah, who became the founder of Islam. But this event occurred, and as a result of that, the people of Axum, they sent a military force in and conquered this city, and that had been taken over, and the Himyarite empire, they overthrew them, and they established a Christian kingdom there. Now, they also built a famous church there that was considered a very beautiful church, a very important and significant church. And so there is a mythology in Islam. It's actually in, I think, Surah 105, where, it talks about the elephant. And so the story is that there was this group of Christian people who they wanted to attack and take over the Kaaba, and that God sent birds who dropped these pieces of clay and like stones on them, stoned them. And so that the elephants, when they got to the gate of the city of Mecca, they wouldn't move forward. That God, there's a mythology, a story about how God stopped them from going into Mecca, and how they were defeated, right? Well, if we look at what actually happened historically, that all this occurred before even the birth of Muhammad ibn Abdullah, just a few years before his birth, but before his birth. And so it's a story he would have probably heard growing up. It's probably something that would have been well known from where he was located. But because it was a little further north of the region where this occurred. But if we look at this history of what happened, this is well documented history. It's in the records of multiple nations. There are people that traveled in the region, and there's just a robust amount of historical evidence that this occurred. And so this massacre occurred. That was actually done by the Jewish kingdom. The Himyarites attacked the Christian group in the famous so-called massacre of Najran in this particular city. And then the people of Axum sent armies in, and they overthrew the Himyarites, and they also established a very famous church there. Well, the story is that these people were making a church to rival the Kaaba. And of course, during this time, the Kaaba was considered a pagan temple because it had multiple different groups of religious artifacts there. Many different religious groups, worshiped there or practiced there because it was a major transit site, a trading corridor. And so many people confused the history of Mecca and what the Kaaba was, and the whole thing. So, but there's a mythology that grew out of it that's also included in the Quran. In addition to that, we can see multiple other stories, like, for example, the story of Mary and the palm tree, that this was a contemporary story that existed in the region, and that Muhammad would more likely have heard about growing up, especially because he worked in caravans and all those things. So even though it's in the Quran and it's presented to us as though this was a revelation that came to him from God, there are multiple stories in the Quran, like the sleepers in the cave, and many other stories, Dul Karnin. All of these are contemporary stories that existed that he would have had to have heard about or had to have known, and that actually predated Islam, and in most cases predated the birth of Muhammad ibn Abdullah. So in terms of being able to understand the Quran in its early period, and the fact that we don't have a single complete Quran for almost 150 years until after the time of Muhammad ibn Abdullah. The fact of the matter is that the history of the manuscript itself of the Quran is very similar to the Bible manuscript, and has very similar connotations in terms of there were various different writings from various different groups that were later compiled, and some held different statuses, where some were considered very authentic, some weren't, and so you ended up with the Quran, and then you later have what's called the hadiths to try to fill in and commentary and interpret what the Quran means. But in terms of, it's important to be able to recognize that this event that took place, this historical event of this massacre at the massacre of Najran in the area near southern Arabia, between what would now be the border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. But this was in 523 BC that this massacre took place. But this was evidence showing the influence that Axum had across the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, and particularly in Yemen. And so this is a very important historical piece in terms of looking at the kingdom of Axum, and not only in terms of looking at it as far as its trade, its economic power, its influence in terms of religion, but we see at the foundation and core of it a system that has developed the the Ethiopian Bible, that's in Ge'ez, that's in a sacred Ethiopian language that has historical roots going back to 1200. And it is a language that is now used primarily for religion, but it is a language that's roots actually go back into ancient Ethiopia, into that region of Ethiopia. And so in terms of looking at the history going forward, the church remains intact until it was attacked in the 1600s by Islamic forces. But even though Islamic forces were able to destroy a lot of churches, cause a lot of damage, they were not able to defeat and bring to an end the Ethiopian Orthodox Chiwahida Church. And it remained intact and remained a foundation, a bedrock for the Ethiopian people. There were also churches that had developed in the areas that now are called Eritrea, in Djibouti, in Somalia. And if you look at this region and you look at what's going on, particularly, in those regions were attacked by Islam, and many of those regions came under the control of Islam. And some portions of Ethiopia came under the control of Islam back and forth, and the borders changed and shifted over periods of time of conflict. But the Ethiopians remained steadfast until eventually they were attacked by the Italians in the late 1800s. And the Italians attempted to secure control of them. They secured control of Libya, but they weren't able to secure control of Ethiopia. And part of the foundation of Ethiopia's stability was the Ethiopian Chiwahida, or the Ethiopian Orthodox Chiwahida Church. And this remained the state religion in Ethiopia all the way up until the time of the overthrow of Haile Selassie in about 1974. So Haile Selassie was overthrown in 1974 with Soviet and Cuban backing. And this was, and you have to remember that Ethiopia had in fact been one of the original founders of the Organization of African Unity. They played a major role and supported the Pan-Africanist movement throughout its existence. They were the key player in moving toward the liberation of Africa and the independence of Africa. And they only came under foreign control for a very short period of time during World War II. For the most part, for the remainder of the time, they remained independent from the very early times, from prior to the from the BC period. So when we look at it and we see Axum, we see various different kingdoms emerge, and it takes shape in over a period of time. But Ethiopia remained a stable power under the Tawahida system, under the Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahida Church. And so in 1975, because there was a Soviet puppet put in, a Soviet and Cuban puppet put in, and also when we look at the evidence surrounding the overthrow of Haile Selassie, we also can see the hand of the Libyan President Muammar Gaddafi, who also, was considered an Arabic country that was part of the Arab League. That even though they were in Africa, they considered themselves part of the Arab League, and they were Islamic primarily. And so, in terms of looking at what happened in Ethiopia and seeing that after less than probably 2 years altogether, the people who had seized power in Ethiopia with Soviet and Cuban and Libyan backing actually were overthrown, and the Ethiopia again regained its independence. But at this point, what they did was they created a separation of church and state in their constitution, and so that the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church became an independent church, but they also allowed Islam and they allowed other religions to develop and flourish in Ethiopia. Now, they did previously, but this created is part of the central governmental system, so that the government made it a law that allowed these others to exist, so that it would not be something that was under the control of the, it's not in terms of looking at the situation. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church had been the government. Now they were no longer the government. There was an independent secular government now. And then all religions were allowed. And so this is part of the history of Ethiopia. So Ethiopia's history is very, very important. We can go back prior to Christianity, prior to Judaism. We can go back and see that in early times, there were various different mixtures of practices that took place in Ethiopia. There were various different groups that vied for power. And many of these religions were natural types of religions. Many were actually similar religions that were practiced in Egypt. And so in terms of going back and looking at the history, in terms of using religion to create a central power structure, was something that began as a practice in ancient Egypt, and it was copied and repeated by many different governments and people around the world establishing their independence. But what's so significant is to be able to recognize the Ethiopian Bible within a historical context, and to be able to see that it was part of the foundational structure of Ethiopia retaining its independence, retaining and maintaining itself in power for nearly 2,000 years. And so this is a very significant accomplishment. This is a very important document to be able to recognize the fact that it had this effect, of being able to be the glue that held that society together, that gave them a common worldview, that enabled them to maintain a common understanding, that enabled them to establish a loyalty to a common theme, to a common system. And so this was the glue that held them together. And this was a very important part of our history to be able to understand. So when we talk about the Ethiopian Bible, it's very important in a historical context. And so, what I want to do is I want to try to just share a couple of things I think that help further establish the context. Okay, and one of the things I'll mention is something called the Book of Judith. Now, the Book of Judith is an apocryphal book. It's also included as an apocrypha in other religious traditions, but it's a story about a wealthy Jewish woman who she deceived what they called in the book the Syrian king Nebuchadnezzar, and that the she eventually seduced him and then cut off his head when they were trying to attack the city where she lived, and they were trying to besiege. She became the hero because she was able to seduce Nebuchadnezzar and cut off his head and then put his head up on the wall. And then the soldiers were frightened away after they saw their king's head up on the wall. So it's an interesting story, the Book of Judith. But the only thing is that many of the things that it contained many glaring inaccuracies. For example, it was well known that Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon and not Assyria. And so there were other major things that indicated that whoever wrote it had some historical inaccuracies. They knew that it was a fiction writing, that it wasn't historical writing, that it was more of a fictional, inspirational writing. So it was considered to be apocrypha because of when it was written, but it was also, it wasn't outside the 200-year boundary, so it wasn't a pseudepigrapha, but it wasn't something that had met the criteria to be canonical. And so there's also a number of other books that that played a significant and important role, like the Book of Enoch, which talked about the Watchers. It talked about had a section that was a section of parables. It had some astronomical writings contained in it, and it also had a number of different dreams and visions. And what was called the Epistle of Enoch. But when we look at the collection of writings that make up the so-called Book of Enoch, first of all, there was no evidence from any other writings that any book called the Book of Enoch survived the flood, the purported flood that is written in the Bible. And as a result of that, it wasn't consistent with the other writings. So in addition to that, it was written at a much later period of time. And because of that, they gave value to it, but they recognized that it couldn't be deemed canonical. And so it wasn't an official part of it wasn't an official part of the church. It was considered apocrypha, even though it was included in some early manuscripts. So there's a number of different things that are significant. Like, for example, in the Ethiopian Bible, there's something called the Book of the Covenants. And it has several sections, including practices that were supposedly followed by the apostles in terms of their liturgy, how they conducted a worship service, how they conducted the Eucharist, the Last Supper, how they did baptism, how priests and church leaders and bishops, how they were supposed to conduct themselves and act, what type of rituals they were to carry out. So all these things were actually documented in Ge'ez in the Ethiopian Bible that were not in other Bibles. And so this was more the administration of the church was preserved in Ge'ez, and supposedly representing the earliest period of time of the church. So they preserved more faithfully the early traditions of the church than any other group of people. And so this was documented and codified in the Ge'ez version of the Ethiopian Bible. So these are some very important things in terms of looking at this and understanding the nature of the scripture itself. But there was also something called the Garama Gospels, And the Garama Gospels, it's really named after the translation that took place. But this Garama Gospels is supposed to be nine, Syrio-Palestinian people that were involved in, in bringing this information, and that eventually it was codified in Ge'ez, and it was called the Garamana Gospels. And so the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, that there's information that is unique to these Gospels. There's, in addition to the unique information, also there's a more grounded line of its historicity in terms of its history. So these are just some features, I think, that are significant. And when we look at the this particular period of time, if we move just a little bit to the west, okay, because you got to remember, picture the map of the Horn of Africa. So you have Somalia on the Horn of Africa today, and then you have Ethiopia, and then you have Djibouti and Eritrea, and then you go up north, and but you have Sudan and South Sudan, this in essence adjacent to and somewhat north of. And so when you look at this map and understand that in 652 CE, there was another tradition of Christian communities that were connected to the Ethiopia, and they were like the bridge between the Coptic Church in the so-called School of Alexandria. So they were like the bridge between the Coptic Church and the Ethiopian Church at a very, very early period of time. And this was part of, in the so-called Sudan, there was the kingdoms of Dongola, Makuria, Aloa, and Nabatea. These were major Christian kingdoms that existed in the southern part of Sudan, so-called Nubia. And these played a very, very important role in Christianity during that period of time, and Christianity in Africa. And they were part of the same tradition as the Ethiopian Church and the Coptic Church. They shared many elements together with both, because they were part of a bridge community. They were clearly in communication with each other based on the evidence that's available. But these communities, there was an attack in 652 that marked the beginning of the trans-Sahara slave trade. This is when when Saudi Arabia was converted to Islam, and they then broke out of the Arabian Peninsula, and they began their attack across North Africa. And they actually began attacks in all directions, but they made this attack across North Africa into Egypt, and they had been able to take control of Egypt. And Egypt fell, that had been under the control of the Byzantine Romans, was now taken over by Arabs. And Arabs then turned their sights, not only turned their sights west to move across North Africa, but they also turned their sights south and moved into the regions that would now be called Sudan and South Sudan. Those regions would be the area called Nubia. So they went into Nubia and they attacked, but they were unsuccessful in being able to defeat and overthrow the Nubians. They attacked Dongola and Makuria, but they weren't able to defeat them. But they were able to establish themselves in such a way where they began to take initially about 360 people every year into slavery from that region and below. And they, in addition to that, continued to expand that until ultimately they were able to overthrow that region. And they actually came in from the Red Sea, and they came across from the Red Sea and attacked from the south and from the eastern part of that region. And they were able to overthrow most of that region. And today, there are literally millions of ruins in that region, including the famous Afad 23 site that goes back 70,000 years in the Sudan, in the area of Sudan. And so were settlements of black people 70,000 years ago, long before there was a Göbekli Tepe or Kurihan Tepe in Turkey, or Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in India, or any of the other sites from around the world. This is the oldest human site so far that where people are building stuff and that are engaged in agriculture, that are engaged in modern types of techniques. And so this occurred before, during a period of time that black people were first beginning to migrate out of Africa. And so there weren't other Homo sapiens sapiens, man with the cranial capacity of modern man, had not come out of Africa. They were just beginning to emerge out of Africa at the time of this Safad 23. But in terms of looking at this history, there are literally over 1 million ruins in this region, the majority of which have not been excavated. Less than probably 0.1% have even been examined or cataloged. There's just massive numbers of ruins there. And this area has been under some type of war and conflict for so long that there's been no solid teams going in to really do excavation, to really do research. And in addition to that, it's been one of those areas that especially European archaeologists and all that, have stayed away from, as well as in the Arab world. They've stayed away from, and one of the reasons why is because their historical narratives, that this region shatters all of their historical narratives. So the narrative about Mesopotamia being the cradle of civilization, the narratives that, of white supremacy, all of these narratives fall apart when you begin to examine this particular region and see that black folk, they were in Africa, building before anybody, before black folk left out of Africa and then peopled the earth and underwent superficial mutations as a result of climatic conditions. So in terms of looking at those things, somebody brought up Albert Perry. There are many people misinformed about Albert Perry. Albert Perry was a black man in South Carolina, and his grandson, not him, his grandson got DNA tests, and his Y DNA showed that his DNA, which included Albert Perry's DNA, came from Cameroon in Africa. And the distinguishing thing about Albert Perry's DNA, his family DNA, was that their Y DNA chromosome went back almost 100,000 years prior to previous estimates as to when Homo sapiens first emerged. Homo sapiens were deemed to have emerged around 300,000 BC. That was the first Homo sapiens, man with the cranial capacity of modern man, the brain case of modern man, was born in Africa, and then he spread out and radiated out around the globe. The case of Albert Perry only establishes that man started in Africa as much as perhaps 100,000 years prior to previously thought. And so, but there's a lot of myths out there that make people, that just outright blatant lie to say that Albert Perry proves that man was in America first and that it went back older than in Africa. But if you actually study the actual evidence, the actual scientific research, what you'll find is that Albert Perry's is from Cameroon, and his DNA goes back 100,000 years prior in Africa. And so that's what's significant about him, and it's just outright bold-faced lie to say that Albert Perry proves that man was in America, 380,000 years ago. It makes no reasonable sense if you go and actually study the report. It's propaganda that is just circulating on social media. And so, in terms of looking at this, and understanding, this information, this evidence, the point that I was trying to get to was I was looking at what was going on in Africa, in the Sudan region, and then also in Ethiopia, in Somalia, Eritrea, in that entire region. If we look across this area, and then if we look across the so-called Sahel, and that's this region between the border of the Sahara Desert and the forest regions in subtropical Africa. So this belt that includes a bunch of savannas and flatlands and grasslands and all that, that this region called the Sahel, we can go to the west and see that, for example, in a place called Kumbi Salah, the writings of Saint Saint Cyril or Saint Caspian, they found writings from this Carthaginian bishop who was also part of the traditions of the Coptic church, the Ethiopian church, and the churches in Nubia, that they found his writings in what is believed to be the ancient capital of Ghana. So there's evidence to suggest that there were Christian communities all across that region, that Christianity actually, there were Christian communities from the Atlantic coast in West Africa all the way to the Red Sea. In addition to that, they have also found evidence of Roman type garrisons, where there's evidence that there was like a Roman military garrison structure that was in place in that region. And whether those were actually Ethiopian or Nubian, or whether they were Roman, the fact of the matter is that more likely than not, even if they were under the control of Rome at some point, they were in fact people of Africa, because you wouldn't have had the European types going down that far and staying for any significant period of time because of the environmental conditions, the weather conditions that existed there. So in terms of looking at across this region, one of the other things that's very important is that if we look at the evidence of Professor Cheikh Anta Diop, and many people you hear about his book called The African Origin of Civilization. He wrote a book called Civilization or Barbarism. He wrote a bunch of books and a bunch of papers, and he was published through UNESCO, the United Nations, and he established that the ancient Egyptian language was an indigenous Black African language. So here, I don't know what's happening here. Okay, and he established that the ancient Egyptian language was an indigenous Black African language, and that all the early kings were indigenous Black Africans from pre-dynastic time to the 14th dynasty. When we look at all of this evidence that Diop brought, one of the things that was most significant to me is that Diop challenged the Arab narrative. Because if you look at what's happening in West Africa particularly, most of what we know and that has come to us from Africa, from West Africa particularly, comes from writers like Ibn Khaldun and Al-Amari, Ibn Battuta and Idrisi, and El Bukhara and El Masudi. And if you go back and began to study these writings and look at these writings, Professor Diop did an extensive study of these writings. He also was, spoke Arabic, and he spoke a number of different languages, French and English, and he did an examination, and he began to challenge some of the Arabic narratives, because particularly from Arab writers. And what he did was he looked at some of the evidence on the ground in terms of building structures. For example, there was a writing about a mosque that was developed, I think it was Al-Amari and Ibn Khaldun wrote about this mosque that was developed in Timbuktu, and how this mosque, was that Mansa Musa brought in this famous Arab architect. And but Diop pointed out that the evidence shows that the structure that they talk about didn't exist, because there were ruins of the structure there, and that those structures actually were of Sudanic design. They were consistent with the designs that were used in the Sudan. And so this claim by people who admitted that they never actually set foot in the area, they were doing secondhand reports, that much of what they're saying is just inaccurate or made up. And Diop pointed some of this out to point out that if we look at this region, you had major structures that were there that actually were indigenous African structures that later Arabs took credit for. And in addition to that, you see a whole body of writing that are translated mainly by Arabs and Sanhaja Berbers, and it's translated using an Arabic script called the Ajazi script. But these writings are actually copying existing writings that existed prior. And so this was an African culture who already had documented things. They had studied astronomy, they had studied different types of sciences, they had just studied about, plants and the ecosystems and all of these kinds of things. And they wrote about all of these things, and then these things got copied, and many of them survived in the University of Sankore in Timbuktu, and then later became part of private collections that people collected when these regions were attacked and besieged as a result of various different foreign invasions. So this whole school of these documents coming back out now that people had in private collections that were part of the Timbuktu collection, the Ahmed Baba collection, many people don't understand it. It's like they don't realize that these are things that were appropriated. It was just like, for example, the golden age of Islam was actually taking the culture and science and philosophy and religion in writings of people like Aristotle and Plato and all of these people. They took their writings and translated them into Arabic. They took their concepts and translated them into Arabic. So people call it a golden age because they actually had plundered and taken a lot of wealth, and they had a period of time where they had some stability and wealth. And they were able then to commission scholars, and people took time to translate it, Greek writings into Arabic, and they took Roman writings and translated them into Arabic and all those things. And so now they get the credit for transmitting this, but most people that just hear about it and don't actually genuinely study it, they look at it, it's a golden age, and just all these discoveries as though the Arabs did all these things. No, the Arabs appropriated the culture of other people. They appropriated the science, the philosophy, the academic work of other people. And just like, for example, in Morocco, if you look at Morocco and you hear about the Moorish invasion of Spain and Portugal in 711 AD, and you hear about that they taught to people geography and math, and they taught them how to bathe and all those kinds of things. Well, there are literally thousands of Roman bathhouses that existed from the first and second century, long before Islam ever even came into existence. And so, what about these bathhouses, these Roman bathhouses? What about all these other things? If you look at the major aqueducts are there, they're not Arab at all. They were Roman. They were built by the Romans. So when we go back and look at people like Septimius Servus, who was a black Roman emperor, and we see it creates a whole different paradigm, a different view of history. And so, it's interesting to look at the history from a perspective of evidence based, of go and examine the actual evidence and not take any particular point of view, and let the facts emerge and let the facts inform us. I think that's what's critical. So we can look at what's happening there. And for example, the Berbers, we look at the Berbers actually took control of the Iberian Peninsula for a short period of time. But in 711 AD, the Berbers did not control Morocco. Then in 711 AD, that whole region was part of the Umayyad Caliphate. So the Umayyads controlled, then the Abbasids controlled. All these were Arab dynasties that controlled that whole region, including the Iberian Peninsula, which Spain and Portugal is located. And it's only a short period of time, for almost 200 years, from about the 11th century to the 13th century, that it came under control of the Almoravid, the Almohad, and the Zirid dynasties, which were Berber dynasties in this region of Morocco. So it's important to be able to contextualize it and put it all in context. But my point that I'm trying to make is I'm trying to paint a picture of what's happening to understand what happens across the Sahel. Because if you look all the way across the Sahel and all the way across the region from the Atlantic coast to the Red Sea coast of Africa, and this band, this belt, this region, it becomes under Islamic attack after 652. And so there's an effort to completely eradicate and destroy the culture, the religion, the philosophy of black people, and to take black people into slavery. And so massive numbers of black people were taken into slavery. Ultimately, the entire trans-Sahara slave trade took an estimated 11 million black people into slavery from sub-Saharan black Africa. In addition to that, about 9 million black people were taken into slavery through the East Africa Indian Ocean slave trade that was perpetrated by Arab Islamic forces. And so in terms of looking at this and understanding this history, recognizing, what's going on in this region, it's also important to note that as this area came under siege, that this is happening almost 800 years before the first Europeans began to become players in the slave trade, before Europeans became significant players at all on the world stage. And so in terms of looking at this and recognizing what's happening, that when Europeans came, Africa was already under siege, especially most of West Africa was well under siege. And we can see, for example, Ahmed Baba, who was considered the scholar of Timbuktu, the University of Sankore. The famous library is named for him and all those things. But Ahmed Baba was actually arrested and imprisoned in Morocco for 12 years on charges of sedition. And the sedition charges grew out of Ahmed Baba claiming that it was an incorrect interpretation of the Quran that allowed black Africans who had accepted Islam to be enslaved, because the local Ummah, the Moroccan Sultanate, and the uh, the Ottoman Caliphate ruled as a matter of law that black people, the sub-Saharan black Africans, could be enslaved regardless of whether they accepted Islam. They could already have accepted Islam and be Muslims and still be enslaved because of being black, because of their skin. And so this was significant because he argued against it and claimed that it was based on a misinterpretation, because in Surah 11:46, the there's a verse that said, "O Noah, he is not of thy family, for his deeds are unrighteous." And so this was interpreted to say that this was a group of people who were excluded by God, Allah, from the human family. So they're excluded from the human family, because the only family alive, supposedly at this time, is who? Is Noah's family. And so once you have this group of people excluded from Noah's family, then they are not part of the human family. And so this became part of the doctrine that was part of Islamic law. And so if we look at it and go back and study it, what we find is that it's an interpretation that comes out of a man by the name of Kabal al-Bir, and then Wab ibn Munabib, where was another scholar that during the early period, right after the time of Muhammad ibn Abdullah's death, that participated in developing this doctrine that became part of Islamic legal system, that enabled them to, when they came in, like to a region and they conquered a region, they would make people who were non-Muslims pay what's called a jizya, a tax. They also could take their children and put them in the military. They could do all kinds of things. They could take their children and raise them separately, and they did that to create Islamic armies. But in addition to those things, they also established that they could enslave the Africans purely on the basis of race, while other people had the opportunity to accept Islam and have a path toward becoming part of the Islamic community. But Africans did not have that same right, because they were considered outside of the family, based upon this Quranic verse and based upon the writings of what was called the Israeliyat, and the interpretation of the Israeliyat by Abir, Kabal Abir, and by Wab ibn Munabib. And so in terms of looking at and understanding this history and seeing how the doctrine that became the foundational basis of chattel slavery actually developed and was developed by Arabs. And then when major challenges came regarding this doctrine and its interpretation, this based on the so-called curse of Canaan or curse of Ham, once it was challenged, they came up with another theory called the seven zones theory, that said that black people in Africa came up in what was called the seventh zone, and it was a hot tropical area, and they came up with a theory about it suppressed them in their brain, and they didn't develop and they didn't evolve like everybody else, so they weren't human. They also said that the people in the north, the YT people, they were also savages and all that because of the nature of the experience that they had living in the cold climatic condition, not having access to food, and they developed a savagery type of behavior system. So this sweet spot in zones 3, 4, and 5 was reserved for the Arabs. And so this became part of a doctrine of Arab supremacy, and it became part of the doctrine that was part of the Islamic world. And then there's if we understand the Quraysh and understand that initially in Islam, the interpretation was that only the Quraysh could be rulers. This was the authentic group that was supposed to be part of Muhammad ibn Abdullah's family and structure. And even though they rejected him, there was conflict. Eventually, they made peace and they became the ruling group. And so it was thought that only people out of this group could be the rulers. And then eventually there was conflict that arose and this is where the split between Sunni and Shia Islam broke off. So, and the Shia maintained that only the Quraysh, and then the Sunni said that any man worthy could be in leadership position, who was devout and faithful. So this is where the split came, which came much later. But it was a fundamentally racist doctrine that established and that became the foundation of chattel slavery against black people in Africa. And also, you also have to remember that later, the Pope Nicholas, in about 1455, actually authorized the Portuguese to take sub-Saharan black Africans into slavery. And part of his rationale and reasoning was based upon this same doctrine that was relied on in the Islamic world. So Africa came under siege then by Arabs and Turks and other groups of people, and as well as from the Roman Empire, and so in terms of, or rather, the Roman papacy, and so in terms of looking at this and understanding the context of all of this, and then seeing what happened, about 12.5 million black people taken into slavery through the West African slave trade. If we look at black Americans today, the average black American, and there are variations in this, but on the average, and this is the central tendency based upon the research done through the National Institute of Health, a number of other major institutions have done this research and examined the DNA records, which there are thousands and thousands of samples of DNA. In addition to that, there are DNA taken from blood banks from all sorts of places that have created a database, which basically has established that the average black American today has between 72 and 74% sub-Saharan black African DNA, and as much as 22 to 24% European DNA, and on average about 0.8% Native American DNA. So the vast majority of black Americans have no Native American DNA. And when we look at the range in terms of African DNA, it may go down to 40% all the way up to 90%. So in terms of looking at the average, the central tendency in looking at this DNA, what is very, very interesting is that DNA from North Africa is anomalous. It's almost non-existent in black Americans. So black Americans do not generally have North African DNA. So we are not Berber admixtures. We are sub-Saharan black African. So in terms of our connection to the so-called Moors, the so-called Asiatic blacks that were admixtures across North Africa, there's no DNA connection to us. So most of what we hear about the Asiatic black man and the Moors, it's all it's based on misinformation. It's cult type it's cult type behavior and actions that was based upon information that they believed at the time that was inaccurate, and they didn't have accurate information. But now we have information. So it's not to condemn them or criticize them. It is just simply to say that they didn't know. But what we're doing is we're sharing this information so that we can all know and that we can all understand and realize that, we didn't participate in the Barbary Wars. We weren't part of the Barbary pirates that enslaved Europeans and all those kinds of things. we had nothing to do with that. It wasn't our people. Our people were from sub-Saharan Black Africa, and is about 95% of Black America's African ancestors come from sub-Saharan Black Africa between modern Senegal and Angola. A little less than 5% come from Southeast Africa and Madagascar. And the average Black person has zero North African DNA. So this is very important in terms of being able to understand the context of things and to recognize our connection to the sub-Saharan Black African, and and how we connect up to this history in terms of, we look across the Sahel, we look at Nubia, we look at Ethiopia, and we look at the fact that our connections are go across those regions. I had a question to come up the other day. There was a discussion about Songhai, and you have many people, because there was a book that came out called The Journey of the Songhai People. If we look at, first of all, most people that I talk to that talk about the journey of the Songhai people, they know the title of the book, but they didn't actually read the book. And but if you get into it and you recognize the Songhai, there was a man by the name of Sunni Ali. Sunni Ali is the founder of the Songhai Empire. The Songhai Empire was an African empire that had Islamic influence, because there was Islam that was, Muslims from Berber Muslims. Sanhaja Berbers came from the north and came into the region, and they had a very heavy influence, and they were engaged in the trans-Saharan slave trade. But this empire was established under Sunni Ali. And then the successor of Sunni Ali was Sikh Muhammad. And Sikh Muhammad actually attempted to impose strict Islam. Sunni Ali actually supported indigenous African religions and tried to create an environment where Muslims and indigenous Black Africans could coexist. But that didn't work very well, because later Sikh Muhammad came, and what he did was he began to do major suppression of the Black Africans. And so there's questions about his origin and whether he was connected in terms of whether he was also part Sanhaja Berber, but also he went in to Morocco, and he was actually designated as the Caliph of West Africa, and which was a title, that he was like the ruler, the Islamic ruler of West Africa. And so when we look at this history, we see that the country fell in 1591. And so when the country fell in 1591, it had been attacked by the Sultan of Morocco, who was a vassal state of the Ottoman Caliph. And what they did was they came in and they had over 150 what they call pashas, who was like a local ruler that was put in charge to be in charge of the region, but they never had control of the whole region. They only had control of the major Islamic centers like Timbuktu and Gao and Jenny, and some of those areas that were under Islam. And most of those areas were populated by Sanhaja Berbers, or Arabs and Sanhaja Berbers. And so the Black population were actually the subject of the trans-Saharan slave trade during that particular time. So many people don't really understand that by the time slavery became, fully intact in terms of transporting Black people, the southern part of Africa, from places like Angola and Cameroon and Nigeria, and those regions, that's where the vast majority of Black people were taken from. It was only maybe, probably just over perhaps maybe 1.5 to 1.8 million taken from the northern part near Senegal, the Gambia, and all those regions. But those people, they weren't taking the Sanhaja Berbers. They weren't taking the people that were part of those kingdoms that emerged out of Songhai, like Futa Jalan and Futa Toro and Sokoto, and so all those places. Those people weren't being taken. They were the ones who were putting black people into slavery. They were the ones that started selling black people, sub-Saharan black Africans, to the Europeans. They sold them into the European slave markets. They protected European slave ships, and they also sold black people in the trans-Sahara slave trade. And so it's important to be able to understand this this issue, just to be able to understand it from a historical standpoint. And I'm just really talking history right now. So this is part of the history. It's important to really recognize and understand this history. But Africa came under siege, and then eventually the Europeans took most of Africa that was under Arab control in the Islamic world. They took it. Europeans took it from them and took control of the trade routes to gain control, the routes to the Indian Ocean trade and all those kinds of things that gave economic power to the Islamic world. They wrestled control away from the Arabs and the Berbers, who were really vassals as well, right? And so it's important to be able to try to put all that in context and realize what happened in terms of black people being dispersed around the world, being taken into slavery in Africa by Arabs, by Turks under the Ottoman Islamic Empire, by Berbers through and Arabs across from the trans-Sahara slave trade, the East Africa, India Ocean trade, and then the Europeans in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. So when we look at this and understand all of these things, the point of talking about the Ethiopian Bible is that the Ethiopian Bible gave Ethiopia that stability so that they were able to be like in the eye of the storm that came through this whole process, and then won the Battle of Adwa after the Berlin Conference, after Africa was divided into colonial territories in 1884 at the Berlin Conference. At the Berlin Conference, not only was the United States present at the Berlin Conference, but the Ottoman Empire was also part of the Berlin Conference. And many people they overlook those facts because they all had an interest and were part of the division and dividing up of Africa. And they all had strategic interest in Africa. But after this Berlin Conference, the Italians tried to have control of Ethiopia, but the Ethiopians defeated the Italians at the Battle of Adwa, actually over a series of battles, but the main battle was the Battle of Adwa, which settled the issue that they weren't going to get control of Ethiopia. And that was in like 1896. And so when we see this is Ethiopia is now still a religious state under the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, and that they have been able to resist and maintain. And they then become part of the Pan-African movement. And this Pan-African movement it involved Ethiopians, it involved black people from America like W.E.B. Du Bois, Bishop Alexander Walters from the African Methodist Church. It involved Henry Sylvester Williams, who was a lawyer from Trinidad. It involved black people from across Central and South America, from Africa, from Asia, and from other parts of the world, where black people came together to advocate for the freedom of black people worldwide, so that to bring an end to colonialism, to bring an end to slavery, to bring an end to the exploitation and the destruction of black people worldwide. And so as a result of this work, these five Pan-African conferences, and then then a the first independent African nation, Ghana, came. Then Nigeria and Guinea, and eventually you had 54 independent black African nations. And these 54 independent black nations that came to power formed what was called the Organization of African Unity. And at the core and center of the Organization of African Unity was Ethiopia, the long-standing independent black entity, the glue that held it all together, the group that put it all together and enabled this to happen, that became the core of African independence. And so they became the driving force. So it's no mistake that they now have this grand Ethiopian hydroelectric dam that has a major power source, in order to industrialize Africa and to begin the industrialization, And so in terms of looking at this information and looking at this history, it's important for us to recognize it. And there's always going to be people who are going to attempt to refute it, but they can't, not legitimately. They can only disrupt they can try to disrupt, but in reality, when you go against the truth, you go against God. And God is going to deal with you for what you are. So make no mistake about it. Make no mistake about it. That there's a reason that I'm able to speak freely. There's a reason that I don't have any fear whatsoever of anybody on this earth. And I'm going to speak the truth that's given to me, because that's my job. That's why I'm here. So you better run away from me, because I'm not playing with you and I'm not alone. So in terms of understanding this history, it's critical that we understand this history, because the future depends on our understanding of the past. That which happened in the past and that which we believe happened in the past conditions the living present and therefore the future. So history is not a dead thing. And we have to be careful to not believe things that are false about the history, because there's a lot of misinformation sources that are attempting to mislead us, to misguide us. And so if we look at today, we have some groups of people who call themselves foundational Black Americans. And they claim that Black Americans are entitled to everything here in America because it was Black Americans who suffered in the slavery, and they're the descendants of slaves. So because of that, people who come from the Caribbean, they don't remember that Black people in the Caribbean were also enslaved by some of the same people. They also don't realize that people that came from Africa as immigrants into America also were besieged by some of the same people in Africa and suffered from the same hands. They don't recognize that. Also, they don't recognize that the rights that they enjoy today, they would not enjoy them had it not been for the support of the international Black community. If you go back and look and understand, back after the Civil War took place, there were numerous civil rights laws. Blacks made significant progress. And then the Compromise of 1877 came. They withdrew federal troops from the South. And Black communities came under siege. There were mob attacks on Black communities. Black people were unalived. They were blocked from being able to vote. There were poll taxes. There were literacy tests, all types of things imposed to stop Black people from being able to vote. They even would come and literally take the ballot box and set it on fire so that Black people votes couldn't count. And there was a physical seizure of Black people and putting Black people in a system of what was called Jim Crow segregation. And so there was as many as 100 different massacres that took place. There were whole black towns that were flooded intentionally. And so all of these things that took place, that was the response to black people seeking political power. That was the response to black people working to, and implement their right to vote and to build businesses and build communities and engage in commerce and take care of their families and do all those things. It was responded to with raw violence. Why didn't that happen in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s? Why? Because the Pan-Africanist movement had resulted in, by 1948, a universal declaration of human rights was established by the United Nations. Who participated in writing and developing this Universal Declaration of Independence? W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary McLeod Bethune, and a number of other significant black leaders and and black people from the Pan-Africanist movement from around the world participated in this and helped enable and make this happen. So you got a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So now you got nations from around the world united to say, well, look, you can't do that. Slavery, you can't do that. Colonialism, you can't do that. And imposing like Jim Crow segregation and all these things, that you can't do that. So you got countries from all around the world now saying that because they've been influenced by W.B. Du Bois and Mary McLeod Bethune and many others who had advocated for this for more than 50 or 60 years, have been engaged in a sustained effort to be able to establish such a thing as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Then, in addition to all of these black people worldwide who were involved in this process, also with the emergence of African countries, now the United States and companies like Nestle, like Hershey, that need cocoa to make their chocolate, where did they get it? They got it from Ghana. They got it from Guinea. They got it from Nigeria. So now the difference is Nkrumah is the president of Guinea. So of Ghana. Sekou Touré is the president of Guinea. You got black people now becoming president of different countries there, and you have the independence movement in Africa. And so these countries are now saying, well, look, if you treat black people bad, because these people know the role that black Americans played in their independence and creating the international pressure to enable them to achieve independence. Because this is something that black people have been working together on for quite some time. So now you have a situation where these countries are putting pressure saying, well, look, West Africa is the second largest source of oil for America. Its first is Canada. Its second largest is West Africa. West Africa produces more oil for the United States than does Saudi Arabia or any of the Gulf states. But most of us don't know that because we don't study that kind of stuff. But that's what the reality is. So you have these countries now, because these countries now have bauxite, they have chromium, they have tungsten and uranium and chromium and rubber and manganese. It's like, so, Firestone, B.F. Goodrich and Goodyear, all of these tire companies now, where you have a booming American automobile industry, but they need rubber. They've been getting rubber from Congo. So now it's like, okay, is our source of rubber going to dry up because we won't give black people the Civil Rights Act? Is our rubber going to dry up because we won't give them a Voting Rights Act? Are we going to be denied the economic opportunities that we've had because we practice discrimination? So it had an impact on the United States. So it's the pressure from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that involve black people worldwide. It is the impact of African countries and their economic influence over the resources that the United States needs, that its economy would come to a halt without these resources. So that's why there's a Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's why there's a Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's why there's a Fair Housing Act of 1968. That's why we have all of these benefits and rights that were established as a result of the Civil Rights Movement that many black people today take for granted, but they don't understand where these rights came from or how they came into existence, because they have not studied history. It's not part of the curriculum in the public school system. They're not getting this information from any single source. And so this is what we're up against. This is what we're dealing with. So it's a miseducation that's taking place. So now there's a cult group that calls themselves FBA. There's a cult group that calls themselves ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves. These groups pretend that, well, because our ancestors were enslaved, we're entitled to these things. So people that are immigrants coming in, people that they shouldn't have anything. So we're anti-immigrant. We're all that. That's the position they've taken. But the fact of the matter is, they would not have any of what they have had it not been for immigrants, had it not been for people who have worked to create the condition to enable their success. So when you look at it, they're a cult driven by misinformation, this FBA and this ADOS, and they don't really understand the history. And because they don't really understand the history, they buy into some stuff that's promoted to them by YT supremacists that is designed and marketed at them in order to disrupt black unity. Why? Because of the fear that they have of the unification of black people, because black unity is their biggest fear. Why? Because Africa right now has about 1.3 billion sub-Saharan people in sub-Saharan black Africa. It is an emerging economy. If you look at it, there are multiple black-owned stock markets in Africa, not one in the United States. There's at least 5 African auto industries that are now mass producing automobiles, electric vehicles. Not one black-owned automobile industry in the United States. Black people are putting satellites in the sky and monitoring their land and their borders and engaging in modern technology. And so if we look at this and understand what's happening, it's just like at the beginning of the 20th century, there was U.S. Steel Corporation. There was a General Electric Corporation. There was the various different major railroad companies that developed. There was U.S. Steel. So when you look at these companies, people back during that time could invest small amounts in these companies and then have a fortune later, because these companies, the stock, grew and then it split and then it grew again and split again. And eventually they obtained major wealth by investing in these companies and being participants in these companies. These opportunities are now on the horizon and available for black people, and particularly black Americans, to participate in the development of Africa and the African diaspora, not just in Africa, but the bridge, the communication, the communities. Because if you look at America, America is getting all these resources out of Africa, exploiting resources into America. Black people are hardly participant in it because we don't understand it. We're outside, we're excluded. But there are black people who would rather deal with black Americans. So in terms of black people in America, the business opportunities and opportunities that we have they're unlike anything that's ever existed before. So having black unity, it puts them in fear. Why? Because right now it is a golden age emerging for black people worldwide. Why? Because Africa has 4 of the 5 largest coltan mines in the world. And in order to have a cell phone, for example, you have to have a mineral called titanium. Titanium is extracted from coltan, and 5 of the largest coltan mines in the world are located in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You see nuclear power plants all around the world that are developing, and this in emerging energy infrastructure is with nuclear. Also, we see nuclear medicine, where nuclear materials being used in various different types of surgery and medical treatments and all those things. So uranium and plutonium and various different radioactive minerals are a very significant market in the global economy. And the vast majority of it, the largest deposits of it, are in Angola, in Namibia. And so these African countries have almost a monopoly in terms of the resources. The question is, are they going to continue to just allow Europeans, Americans, Russians, and other people to just come in and take it from them? And they don't get any real benefit from it. Where most of these African countries have such an abundance of mineral wealth that nearly all of them would have the capacity to be much more wealthy than Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or any of those Gulf countries that are have oil and that are major economic powers. African countries have so much more wealth in the ground that they should be way more wealthy than any of those places, because they have nothing in comparison to some of these African countries. But the relationship has been one of exploitation in the past. And that's why Africa is starving. That's why Africa is having the problems that it had. But Africa is emerging from those problems. And there are black people in America who are engaged, who are working. There are black people now who are taking citizenship in Ghana, taking citizenship in South Africa, taking citizenship in Nigeria, who are having dual citizenship, who are players on the international marketplace. And so this is an emerging process. So they do what they can to pick us off, to target us with misinformation. It's like, it's like having fish in a barrel. They're shooting fish in a barrel. Why? Because you're on social media and they can target you with misinformation. They can tell you lies and brainwash you and give you all kinds of stupid stuff that you believe because you don't know any better, because you don't know your history. And that's why we're here talking about the history. This is why we're here to share the history so that you can wake up, so that you can understand what really is going on, that you can see that you're being attacked. There's a misinformation campaign designed to separate you, to get black people fighting amongst each other. So you got the FBA attacking Africans, and you got the pretendians, the so-called indigenous, black Native Americans who claim they were always here. All misinformation, all built on misinformation. But these are people who now are attacking Africans, attacking Africa, attacking what they call Pan-Africans. But you talk to them, they don't know anything about Pan-Africanism. They don't know much about our history at all. They just simply are regurgitating a bunch of garbage that has been flowing to them through their social media accounts. Their information is packaged and sent to them through the Russian SVR and through the Internet Research Council from St. Petersburg, Russia, and from Northern Macedonia, where they also have troll farms. It's being sent from Iran. It's being sent from Arizona and other areas of the country where you have YT supremacy troll farms that's bombarding black people, because all of these people have an interest in black people not coming together. They have an interest in keeping black people from rising. And so right now, today, if you look at, say, for example, Nairobi, Kenya, look at Accra, Ghana, look at Lagos, Nigeria, look at Johannesburg, South Africa, you go around and you see there are major cities all across Africa, and you see Africa beginning to industrialize. You see Africa, having modern conveniences and all those things. But you also see people living in rural areas that have not been reached, that may not have electricity, that are in poverty. You see war-torn areas where people are in poverty and people are, even denied the opportunity to cultivate their own land. So you've got problems that exist there, but these problems are being systematically attacked. They're being systematically resolved. And black people are making significant progress. There's a long way to go, but we've made substantial progress. They're now building major highways along each coast, the west coast and east coast of Africa, to connect Africa by highway. They're doing high-speed rail systems connecting African cities. There's something called the Lobato Corridor, where it's a rail system coming from the eastern coast or eastern region of Democratic Republic of Congo down into Zambia and also out to Angola to the port of Lobato. It's a major economic corridor that there be highway systems all along that corridor, as well as communities develop in industries and businesses, so that it'd be a major development place. If we look at the development that's actually taking place in Africa and what's going on, they represent major opportunities for black people, whether you are a highway construction contractor, whether you're a home builder, whether you're an electrician, whether you have any of those kind of skills, or a businessman who engages in the stock market, who participates in the development of publicly traded companies. And it's a wide open market there. And also, yes, there are Chinese players in developing the infrastructure. There's also alternative financing systems from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and the traditional systems that have been controlled by America and France and European countries that have attempted to force policies that stop black people from being able to, for example, they take the minerals out of the ground, but they can't process these materials. They just sell them to the Europeans. So the only jobs are people taking them out of the ground at a real cheap price. And what's happening is, instead of processing them, which would create a bunch of other jobs, it keeps Africa poor. It keeps Africa in squalor. Well, African countries now are moving away from allowing those policies. And this is why you see certain upheavals and certain conflicts with Western powers. Why? Because they're moving away. Plus, the involvement of China has created a different dynamic. It gives an opportunity, an alternative. So when we look at what's happening in Africa, and you look at the role black Americans, and you look at black people worldwide, because there are 112 million Afro Brazilians. There's 12 million Afro-Colombians. And you start looking all around and you see all of these places. There's some 700 million people of African descent who came to the areas they are. Their ancestors came as in slavery. And these communities that exist now, that are becoming aware of themselves, that are becoming conscious of their history, that are realizing that we are all victims and part of an African Holocaust that took place, where some 32.5 million black people were taken into slavery and dispersed around the world, not just in the Americas, but were dispersed in Asia and Southeast Asia and in the Middle East and all these places where these black communities emerged that were taken originally there as slaves. We're also becoming aware of what happened in Africa, that not just looking at the Berlin Conference, but look at what happened that enabled the Berlin Conference before and after. And we see 10 to 15 million people exterminated in the so-called Congo Free State under King Leopold. When King Leopold unalived 10 to 15 million people, black people, in order to exploit them, to take rubber, that established the rubber industry. And it was around the same time the automobile industry was emerging, and the price for rubber worldwide was a major commodity. And in order to take advantage of that, to reap wealth, they unalived 10 to 15 million black people. If you look in Southern Africa, like the diamond industry and various different other types of precious stones and minerals, you see Cecil Rhodes and De Beers diamonds, and you see the fact that in this particular region of the country, some 50 million black people were unalived. And so that's what we're dealing with when we start looking at the overall picture in Nambia. You have in Southwest Africa, Nambia, you have the Germans actually come in there and try to exterminate the population. And in addition to that, they started concentration camps in like 1904 to 1908. Long before there was a single concentration camp in the Third Reich in Germany. And so they did that first on Shark Island off the coast of Namibia. And they had the Shark Island massacres, and they had concentration camps for black people. So most of us don't really understand the connection or the history. And this is why it's so important for us to know the history, because this history, it changes things. It it connects us. It helps us to understand the global picture and how we are connected, and to realize that we have more in common than we have differences. So you have people that are going to a petty thing about what he said, she said, and they're attacking each other, and about who had what culture and who took whose culture and all. That's FBA. That's the Pretendians. That's some low intellectual functioning stuff. And we've got to move beyond it. We've got to elevate our understanding of the world and rise above these petty conversations, these petty differences, and realize what we have in common, realize how we are connected, and realize the importance of our unity and coming together. Why? Because we have people that are literally attempting to move us toward genocide. We have people that are attempting to erode our rights, to take away our voting rights, to take away our civil rights. We have people that, like, you look at some 300,000 black women in the last 6 months have lost their jobs because of the policies of this administration. And you still got black people who people claiming, that they are FBA and all that. They're supporting an administration now that has caused some 300,000 black women to lose their jobs. It will have a devastating impact on black families across this country. When you look at what's actually happening, these people, they are no different than the YT people attempting to damage and destroy us. There's no distinguishable difference between them. Whether they're doing it unwittingly, intentionally, they are Stephen on Django. If you look at the movie Django and you see the character Stephen, that's who they are. They are the Stephens. And we need to start calling them that. Say, hey, Stephen, what's happening? Stephen, because that's who they are. And so the reality of it is that their job is to try to protect the system, and they don't have any concern about the rest of us. Most of them are just selfish individuals. They got a little spot they want to maintain, and they don't care what happens to the rest of us. They're ready to sell us all out, they're trying to, they are actively attempting to sell us all out for a few morsels of bread. And they're not even getting anything that gives them any future stability. They are the lowest of the low. And so in terms of understanding it, we just have to understand what it really is, right? And realize how significant and how important understanding our history is. And again, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima used to always say to me, that that which happened in the past and that which we believe happened in the past conditions the living present and therefore the future. So history is not a dead thing. And then Professor Diop always said that we have to rescue and reconstruct Black history, not in a protest posture, not based on myths or half-truths, but based upon facts and empirical evidence. Why? Because that which happened in the past conditions the living present. But also, those things we believed happened in the past also will condition the living present. So if we function off of misinformation, and people can feed us misinformation and we'll think we are Asiatic Blacks. So we'll support things that are against the interests of Black people in general. We think we are Moors. So we will support things that are against the interests of Black people in general. We are led to believe in these false identities that many of us grabbed hold of those because we didn't have anything else. And we didn't have any basis, to be clear. It was part of our growth process. But now that we know better, we have to do better. Now that we understand better, we have to do better. We have to be better. And this is why it's so critical for us to learn and understand this history, because that which happened in the past conditions the living present. And we want to be grounded in reality. Because if you're out of touch with reality, if you're out of touch with what really happened in the past, you'll function off some myths and lies, and it'll take you down the path of la-la land. And you'll work against your own interests. You'll work against the interests of your own people. You'll become the enemy of yourself. You'll become the enemy of your grandchildren, of your posterity. You'll be working to destroy them. Why? Because you didn't know. You didn't understand. So now there's no excuse. And this is why we are here to wake you up. We're here to share this information, to wake you up so that you can have the truth in one hand and the lie in the other. Compare the truth that we're sharing with the lie in the other hand, and compare it and examine it. Do some research on it and learn how to actually do quality research. And what you'll find is that the truth is the only lasting joy. It is the foundation of us moving forward. And one of the things I now land with this is that if we go back and look at the stability that the Ethiopian Bible gave, that was written in Ge'ez, that became the foundation of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, that this foundation structure that carried us for the last 2,000 years and that helped bring about this emerging African unity. If we understand it in context, you'll be able to recognize and see why we are working right now toward, in the year 2030, 5 years from now, less than 5 years from now, to have a African Holocaust called African Holocaust World Assembly. African Holocaust World Assembly. And that is for Black people worldwide, whether we are in the United States in America, whether we are in Brazil, or whether we are in Colombia, or Venezuela, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, Mexico, whether we are in Palestine, whether we are in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, whether we are in of the 13 million Afro-Iranians, Black people of African descent in Iran, in the southern part of Iran, whether we are that are oppressed, whether we are part of the Afro-Pakistani community, the Afro-Filipino, or the Afro-Indonesian communities, wherever we are in the world, that we are able to come together to be able to recognize the fact that we all have in common this African Holocaust. And we memorialize this experience that we had, that we make it a solemn occasion, a solemn assembly, that we all come together and acknowledge this and build upon that a foundation of unity worldwide, to build trade relations, to build international commerce, to build our economic foundation, to build a connection and bridge between each other so that our communities become connected, so that family members who generations ago, where some may have been taken and sold on a ship and sold to North America, some may have been taken on a ship, sold to South America, some may have been taken and crossed the Sahara Desert and were taken into slavery in the Arab world. Some were taken out to the East Coast and sold into slavery in the East Africa Indian Ocean slave trade. But there are black people from single families and single groups that were taken from the same family and sent out all over the world. And so, like a shattered diamond is how Diop describes it. And much of our history is in private museums and collections all around the world, and in museums, major museums. And we have to rescue and reconstruct our history, to reconnect the dry bones in the valley. And so this is what we're talking about. This is a resurrection in 2030. And so I invite you to participate with us. I invite you to learn this information and to be able to teach it and share it, because this is information to be shared. And so with that, thank you for taking the time to listen, and everyone have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.